so you can just fit this curve basically to a straight line, even it out, so you get a nice, clear image. But what it also does is, this is the histogram before, is it really serves to sort of confine, solidify the gray phase. It's a very nice peak. So segmenting on either side with this threshold is much easier. This is something we've kind of been playing around with. The effectiveness of it is questionable, but it works pretty well depending on your images. But a lot of times you get these vertical stripes, which I think are visible enough for you here. This it's not necessarily curving, but almost like a streaking from the ion beam. And what you can do is take the Fourier transform of this image shown here, and basically block out this horizontal highlighted phase, which corresponds to periodic vertical structures in the image. And I'll kind of go back and forth, and it's a little hard to see, but if you focus on this area, for example, you can see that it kind of evens out those stripings that occur without really affecting any of these interfaces or the structure as a whole. So this is another issue we kind of found out quickly when dealing with a voxelized structure in 3 phases. Anytime you do any sort of thresholding, when you have an interface between a white phase and a black phase, invariably, so here's a white particle and here's a black core, and you've got this interface. Invariably, you've got this gradient across here, and there's going to be gray voxels there. So this effect that you see when you do a double threshold is that basically a lot of these white particles get coated with this gray coating, for no better word for it. So we had to write a program that basically identified the gray coating only on white particles so that we could get rid of it without affecting our gray structure, which would be our YC, and also maintaining the same volume percentage. So if you see, it's going to coat the whole particle. The idea is we can identify these specific gray gray voxels between white and black, and then selectively turn some black and some white in an even manner so that the volume percentages aren't affected. So that's what we're showing there. I think this is the last image processing highlight I'm going to show. So we showed that you get sort of illumination changes on a single image, but you can also, throughout your set of images, get changing brightness between all your images. And this is something actually that kind of came up on a recent data set we got. A lot of our earlier ones, we didn't see this, and not really sure why it happens. It could just be a function of the detector you're using. You're milling out more material, so it's kind of a bigger trench, and so you can get more electrons out. But generally, the brightness was increasing. This is image number as you go further along the data set. And I tested these before. These are just little movies. I don't think they're going to work. But basically it shows it's a movie of the histogram of each image as you move through the set. And basically what happens is the brightness overall increases. So both of these peaks shift over by about 40 to 50 grayscale values, which if you're thresholding at a fixed value, basically you can't. Scott developed a program that basically fits these 2 curves to a polynomial, and then sets the threshold based on the histogram for each image. And so you can see as the histogram shifts over, these threshold values shift. We call this dynamic threshold. So basically it adjusts to the quality of each image. So now I'm going to get into kind of the second half of the talk, which is on the calculations that we do. And some of the issues we ran into in developing these calculations and things. This is kind of all the I guess the seedy underbelly of making a reconstruction. Is how do you actually go about dealing with these issues? How much error is involved? So one thing that we've already seen for our surface area calculation is we take our voxelized structure and we mesh it. So we make these vertices with the polygons or triangle surface, just like Peter showed. But when you do this, you can get this kind of ripple effect depending on the shape of your voxels. It's basically called a wedding cake effect, where you have some roughness to the surface as a function of going from a voxelized structure. And so to get a surface area calculation, you need to smooth this surface a little bit. It's just a question of how do you do that and how much do you do it. basically we kind of mixed a quantitative analysis of the actual surface area with qualitative analysis, actually just looking at what this does to the surface and the structure. And the idea is you can do a bulk smoothing. This is on the voxelized structure. It's pretty common where you take a single voxel, look at all the voxels around it and average, and then reassign that voxel color, and that tends to smooth out surfaces. But this generally is not a good technique because it can change your structure. You can see that if you have very thin necks, they'll tend to break apart particles, and it's not a good method for it. So what we found was if you mesh the surface and then do a smoothing on the mesh, and this basically is you can think of all these vertices on the surface as applying a spring to them, kind of like the vector that Peter was showing, where they want to go back to kind of a smooth surface. And that's this value here, the 0.5 is called a gamma factor. And this number here is basically how many iterations of this smoothing you do. And we just kind of found an optimum where we're smoothing the surface to a point, but then after you go past iterations to 6 iterations, the surface is as smooth as it's going to get, and you end up actually starting to shrink your structure. So it's just trying to find a nice medium between the two. So this is just a diagram of how we do our, how we identify our triple phase boundaries and also calculate connectivity of phases. And I've shown this at a couple talks, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. But the idea is that if you take a single phase, you can find where there are isolated particles, and then also what we call unknowns, which are isolated particles that intersect the boundary of your volume. So they're isolated within what we can see, but we don't know if they're connected outside of the structure. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. But in addition to that, we can identify the triple phase boundaries, but then also we know where these isolated and unknown particles are. And for that boundary to be active, it has to be on 3 percolated networks. So we do this connectivity calculation on each of the 3 phases. And from that, we can figure out of the total TPV line density, which is just shown here. The green represent this electrochemically active TPV density. So all of what I've shown has been on bulk electrodes, where we basically just looked at the active layer of the electrode. We're calculating sort of macroscopic structural values, TPV density, surface area density. But one thing we started doing the past year was saying, well, what if, so this is how we originally would crop the images, and this is a LSM-YC cathode with an LSM current collector, YC electrolyte. We had a few samples where we'd actually milled enough material here where we could crop with these interfaces on the structure as well. And so this kind of just shows a section of the reconstruction with the full span of this active layer of electrode with the interfaces with the electrolyte and the current collector on either side. And this comes into play where, as I mentioned, you can calculate this connectivity, but there's actually some variation in how you define connectivity. And we kind of took a stab at it, but there's actually a lot of different ways of doing this, and I think this is a good topic of discussion. So one method when you have these interfaces here is called the directional connectivity, where we know this LSM particle has to connect somehow back to this current collector layer. Vice versa, this YC particle here has to percolate back to this left side. And same with the pore percolating back to the right. Now because we actually have the interfaces there, we know, as long as it's not on the edge of the boundary, whether or not that particle is percolated. So we haven't cropped anything and we're guessing. This we actually know whether it should be. But there's all different ways you can do this, depending on which directions, and you can average the values. This is a little convoluted, but basically this is a study we did with a series of cathodes with varying LSM-YC ratio. So you can just think of this as, this is actually the YC weight percent on the bottom, so it's just 100 minus the LSM. So this is 30% LSM, this is 70%, so you're reducing the LSM content. And you can see your active LSM volume percentage is reducing. But depending on how you define this connectivity, so isotropic is any two, that it connects between any 2 faces of your volume. This X plus minus, Y plus minus is basically doing this directional connectivity in each of the 6 directions on a cropped structure, so you don't have the interfaces there. The average is the average of those 6. You could also do connectivity where it has to be connected between any 2 opposite faces. And then also what I just showed